My entitled mom tried to take my house from my pregnant sister, claiming she deserves it more than I do. The day my mother and sister barged into my house was the day I realized the full extent of the entitlement and manipulation that had permeated my family for years. This was not just a disagreement over property or inheritance. It was a showdown between everything that had shaped my childhood and the man I had become. Little did I know, this confrontation would be the ultimate revelation of the dynamics between us, a clash of expectations, delusions, and an unwavering sense of justice. I grew up in a household divided not by walls, but by favoritism. My mother, always the controlling figure, made it no secret that my sister, Jane, was her favorite. Jane was the one who resembled her the most, both in appearance and in temperament. She had my mother's domineering personality, her ability to manipulate, and her affinity for always getting what she wanted. My father, on the other hand, was a practical and hard-working man. He ran his own small business and tried to instill the same values in me. He taught me how to navigate life's challenges with a steady hand and a clear mind. When my parents divorced, it wasn't a surprise that I chose to live with my father while Jane stayed with my mother. The divorce had not been amicable. It was messy, filled with accusations, and clouded by the bitterness of infidelity. My mother had rekindled a relationship with an old high school boyfriend. And my father, rather than wasting time arguing, decided it was best to walk away and start afresh. He moved us into a smaller, cozier home, and it was there that he taught me everything about his business, a small but thriving enterprise. I was 16 when I started working with him, and by 28, I was a partner. My father was the kind of man who believed in hard work, but he also believed in leaving a legacy. Jane, on the other hand, was content with her life living with my mother, who continued to coddle her well into her late 20s. She floated from one part-time job to another, always relying on my mother's support and the generosity of others. She never seemed to take responsibility for anything, and every time she faced a setback, it was someone else's fault. My mother enabled this behavior, always ready to swoop in and save her from any consequences. 8 months ago, my father passed away. He had been sick for some time, his health compromised by years of heavy smoking. When the pandemic hit, his weakened immune system couldn't withstand the onslaught of the virus. He fought bravely, but ultimately, we lost him. It was a hard blow, but in some ways, it was also a catalyst for what was to come. My father's will was read shortly after the funeral, and as I had expected, he left the majority of his assets to me, the house, the business, and his savings. Jane received a car and a few personal items, while my mother was given a small token amount, just enough to acknowledge her, but not enough to suggest she had any claim over his estate. I thought that would be the end of it. My mother and sister hadn't been in our lives for years, and I assumed they would continue to stay away. I was wrong. One evening, as my girlfriend and I were settling in for dinner, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, there stood my mother and Jane. Their expressions were cold, and before I could even ask why they were there, they pushed their way inside. My girlfriend, Emily, exchanged a confused glance with me as my mother made herself comfortable on the couch, demanding a glass of water. Jane, meanwhile, started wandering around the house, opening doors, peering into rooms, and making comments about the decor. It was as if they had walked into a house they already owned. "What are you doing here?" I finally asked, my patience wearing thin as I watched Jane open the door to my office. My mother took a sip of the water Emily had handed her and looked at me with a smug smile. "Well, I think it's time you did your brotherly duty," she said. I blinked, not quite understanding what she meant. "What, now that your father is gone?" She continued. "This house ought to belong to me. I was his only spouse. After all, but since you have it now, you should do the right thing and give it to your sister. She's pregnant, and she needs it more than you do." I stared at her, stunned. It wasn't just the audacity of her words, it was the casual way she said them, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. Jane, who had now rejoined us in the living room, was smiling, clearly pleased with herself. "You can afford to buy a new house," my mother continued. "You make good money, but Jane needs a stable home, especially now that she's expecting. You could stay here, of course, if you wanted, just in one of the smaller rooms. Or better yet, you could move out and let her have the whole place." Emily and I exchanged another look, and I could see the disbelief mirrored in her eyes. This was beyond anything we had expected. My mother had always been manipulative, but this was on another level entirely. That's not happening, I said, my voice steady. This is my house. Dad left it to me. I'm not giving it up. My mother's expression darkened. I am your mother, she said, her voice rising. I brought you into this world. And you will do as I say. You owe this to your sister. She needs this house more than you do. You can find somewhere else to live. Jane, who had been silent until now, chimed in. Come on, big brother. Don't be selfish. You know I've had a hard time. This is what Dad would have wanted. I felt a surge of anger. No, I said firmly. This is what Dad wanted. He left me the house because he knew I would take care of it. He knew I would respect his wishes. You have no right to come in here and make demands. My mother stood up, her face twisted with rage. If you don't give us the house, she said, her voice trembling with anger, I will make your life miserable. I will tell everyone that you're kicking your pregnant sister out onto the street. I will ruin you. Emily, who had been quietly recording the entire exchange on her phone, spoke up for the first time. You should leave, she said, her voice calm but firm. This is not your house. You have no right to be here. And if you don't leave, we will call the police. My mother turned to her, her eyes narrowing. Stay out of this, she snapped. This is family business. Emily didn't flinch. This is our home, she said, and you are trespassing. I took out my phone and started dialing. My mother's eyes widened, and she lunged at me, trying to knock the phone out of my hand. I stepped back, avoiding her grasp, and held the phone up out of her reach. That's it, I said. You need to leave, now. Jane started crying, her face crumpling as she looked at my mother. Mommy, make him stop, she wailed. My mother turned back to me, her face red with fury. You will regret this, she hissed. You think you're so smart. But you're just like your father, selfish and ungrateful. You don't deserve this house. You don't deserve anything. I shook my head, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. No, I said, I deserve this because I worked for it. I deserve this because Dad trusted me. And I'm not going to let you take that away from me. My mother glared at me for a moment longer, then turned on her heel and stormed out of the house, dragging Jane behind her. As they left, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. This was not the end. I knew my mother well enough to know she wouldn't give up that easily, but it was a start. In the days that followed, my mother and Jane launched a smear campaign against me on social media. They posted lies about how I had stolen the house from Jane, how I had manipulated the will, how I was throwing my pregnant sister out onto the street. Some people believed them, family members, old friends, people who didn't know the full story. But many others reached out to me, offering their support, telling me they knew what kind of person my mother was. I spoke to my lawyer, who was also my father's old friend, and we decided to take action. We sent a cease and desist letter to my mother and Jane, demanding that they remove the false posts and issue a public apology. At first, they refused, but when we threatened to take them to court, they backed down. The posts were deleted, and my mother posted a half-hearted apology, claiming she had acted out of concern for Jane and had misunderstood the situation. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I knew that my relationship with my mother and sister was beyond repair. But I also knew that I had done the right thing. I had stood up for myself, for my father's legacy, and for the life I had built. And in the end, that was all that mattered. This entire experience taught me a lot about entitlement, manipulation, and the importance of standing up for what is right. My mother and sister had always believed that they were owed something simply because of who they were. They thought that because my mother had once been married to my father, she had a right to his estate. They thought that because Jane was pregnant, she deserved my house. But life doesn't work that way. You don't get something just because you want it, or because you think you deserve it. You have to work for it, earn it, and respect the people who have helped you along the way. My father worked his whole life to provide for me, to build a legacy that he could pass on. He trusted me to take care of that legacy, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me, not even my own family. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if maybe I was being too harsh, too unyielding, but in the end, I realized that standing up for myself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. It was about more than just a house or an inheritance. It was about respecting my father's wishes, about honoring the life he had built, and about refusing to let anyone, no matter who they were, take advantage of me. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, the people who try to hurt us the most are the ones who are supposed to love us. Sometimes, the hardest thing we can do is stand up to them. To say no, to draw a line and refuse to let them cross it. But it's also the most important thing we can do, for ourselves. For the people we love. And for the future we want to build. I don't know what will happen with my mother and sister in the future. I hope that one day they will understand why I did what I did. Why I couldn't just give in to their demands. But even if they don't, I know that I made the right choice. And that's enough for me. Karen demands VIP table claiming to know the owner. But I'm the owner. And she was left crying with a $4 bill after my revenge. There's something almost magical about stepping into a beautifully lit restaurant. With the smell of freshly cooked food hanging in the air. The laughter and clinking of glasses from satisfied patrons filling the space. But sometimes, beneath the warmth and comfort of these familiar scenes lies a story of unexpected twists. One that turns entitlement into humility and arrogance into a harsh lesson. Let me tell you the tale of Karen and the VIP table. A story of false bravado and well-deserved retribution. Karen stormed into the restaurant with a confidence that could convince anyone watching that she belonged. Her hair impeccably styled, her stride confident, and her voice unapologetically loud. She announced that she needed a table for 6. Behind her trailed 5 young women, each exuding a similar aura of privilege, seemingly unaware that their evening would soon take a turn that none of them could foresee. She looked at the waiter who greeted her with a polite smile. "I didn't make a reservation. But it's okay. The owner is a personal friend of mine. He said he keeps tables open for special guests like us." Karen spoke with a certainty that brooked no argument. A look of superiority on her face as she glanced at the waiter. A man she assumed was there to serve her every whim. Without question, unbeknownst to Karen, the waiter she was trying to impress was, in fact, the owner of the restaurant, a man who had spent most of his life working in this establishment that had been in his family for generations. He had inherited not just the ownership, but the culture, the ethos, and the pride that came from running a restaurant that had grown from a small family eatery into a sought-after destination for high-profile events. The owner had spent years transforming it, from modernizing the interiors to building a clientele that included celebrities and influencers. He had seen it all, from demanding patrons to genuinely grateful customers. But nothing could quite prepare him for Karen. He decided not to reveal his identity right away. Instead, he put on his best customer service smile, nodded, and replied, "Of course, ma'am, please follow me." Karen's smug look barely registered his response. She waved her hand in the air dismissively, as if she'd done him a favor by gracing the restaurant with her presence. Her friends followed, giggling at some private joke, as he led them to one of the tables that were typically reserved for VIP guests. As they settled in, Karen wasted no time in making demands, ordering rounds of cocktails, making little jabs at the wait staff, and even talking down to the owner himself. Unaware of who he was, she leaned in toward her friends at one point, her voice just loud enough for the owner to hear as she quipped, "I bet his entire life is this restaurant. Poor guy, doesn't he realize he's just a waiter?" The owner, maintaining his calm, couldn't help but feel the sting of her words. There was something particularly demeaning about how she spoke, a sense of disregard for the hard work and dedication it took to keep a place like this thriving. But he knew he had a plan. If Karen wanted to experience what it was like to dine like a VIP, he would let her, with all the bells and whistles attached. He started with offering them 3 rounds of drinks on the house, which Karen gleefully accepted. The drinks flowed, and the girls became increasingly more animated, their voices growing louder as they reveled in their imagined importance. All the while, they were unaware that they were seated at a table that normally carried a significant fee for those who didn't make reservations. The drinks they were consuming weren't the typical fare. These were high-end, handcrafted cocktails with the finest ingredients. The menu they had been given was a special one as well, a carefully curated selection without any prices listed, reserved for high-profile guests. It wasn't long before the food started arriving, gourmet dishes with rare ingredients, each more luxurious than the last. Truffle pasta, imported oysters, delicacies that Karen had never dreamed she'd be ordering that night. But she didn't care about the cost. After all, the owner was a personal friend, right? Hours passed, And as the plates were cleared and more drinks were served, Karen's demeanor shifted from arrogant confidence to oblivious intoxication. The owner, ever watchful, ensured that they were well taken care of, while quietly keeping track of every single thing they ordered. When the night began winding down, and the girls were laughing a little too loudly, the owner decided it was time to bring the evening to a close. He approached the table, carrying a leather folder that contained the bill, a bill that reflected every cocktail, every luxury dish, and, most importantly, the price tag for the VIP table they had taken without reservation. It was a bill that amounted to over $4. Karen, who had been in the middle of another disparaging comment about the wait staff, paused as the owner handed her the bill. Her eyes widened, her face going pale as she scanned the total. This can't be right," she stammered, the earlier bravado vanishing in an instant. She looked up at the owner, her voice trembling slightly. "There must be some kind of mistake," the owner said. The owner simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, ma'am, this is the correct bill. You did say you knew the owner personally, correct?" He leaned in slightly, his voice soft but firm. "Well, here I am." The realization hit Karen like a ton of bricks. Her eyes darted around the table, her friends staring at her in shock, their earlier giggles now replaced with uneasy silence. She tried to argue, tried to bring up her supposed connection to the owner. But it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no escaping the consequences of her arrogance. In the end, Karen had no choice but to pay the bill. She handed over her credit card, her hands shaking as she did so. The owner took it, swiped it, and returned it to her without another word. He watched as she and her friends gathered their things. The atmosphere at the table now completely different from the lively scene it had been just moments before. They left without another word. Karen's head hung low, her earlier confidence shattered. 2 days later, a man walked into the restaurant, Karen's father. He demanded to speak with the owner, his face flushed with anger. The owner, calm as ever, led him to his office and played back the security footage of that night, footage that included audio capturing every disparaging remark, every entitled demand. The father's face turned from anger to embarrassment as he listened, his daughter sitting beside him, her head bowed in shame. When the footage ended, the father stood up, muttering an apology before storming out, dragging Karen behind him. The owner watched them leave, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. He hadn't set out to embarrass anyone, but sometimes, people needed to be taught a lesson, especially when they disrespected those who worked hard to provide them with an experience they took for granted. This story isn't just about Karen and her entitled behavior. It's about the broader issue of how we treat those who serve us. Whether it's a waiter, a janitor, or anyone in a position we might perceive as beneath us. There's an important lesson to be learned. Every job has value, and every person deserves respect. Take, for example, the story of a janitor at a prestigious university. Despite working long hours to keep the campus clean, he was often overlooked by students and faculty alike. It wasn't until one professor took the time to talk to him, to learn his story, that the janitor's true contribution was recognized. He wasn't just cleaning the halls, he was creating an environment where students could learn, where professors could teach. Without distraction, his work was foundational, even if it wasn't always acknowledged. In another instance, a young barista at a busy coffee shop was constantly belittled by a regular customer, a businessman who saw her as nothing more than someone to fulfill his coffee order. One day, the barista, tired of the constant disrespect, decided to stand up for herself. She calmly explained to the man that while her job might seem insignificant to him, it was important to her, and it helped her pay for her education. The businessman, taken aback, apologized, realizing that he had been treating her as less than human simply because of her job title. These stories, much like Karen's, serve as reminders that no matter our position in life, we all deserve to be treated with dignity. The restaurant owner could have easily thrown Karen and her friends out the moment she started making demands. But he chose a different path. He chose to show her what it really meant to dine like a VIP, and the cost that came with it. The final lesson here is simple. Entitlement gets you nowhere. Respect, humility, and kindness, on the other hand, can open doors you never even knew existed. The next time you find yourself in a position of being served, whether it's at a restaurant, a coffee shop, or anywhere else, Take a moment to appreciate the person on the other side. You never know their story. And you never know what it took for them to be there, providing you with the experience you're enjoying. Karen's story might have ended with a hefty bill and a lesson learned the hard way. But for the rest of us, it serves as a reminder: treat people with respect, regardless of their job title. Because, at the end of the day, it's not the position that defines a person, it's their character.